We are still with Abimelech and Sarah and Abraham. And I need to finish up with them, but before I do, I'll refresh us a little bit on what's been going on. We had, and they felt like this occasion here that where Abraham had joined or journeyed down to the Negeb and settled in Kadesh and Shur and resided in Gerar as an alien, and then Abimelech was king there, and then sort of like Pharaoh, he sees Sarah and wants to take her into his harem and so forth. And in this story, God comes to him in a dream and tells him, don't touch her, she's a married woman. And then he goes and chastises Abraham for not telling him the truth. And he's, but I did tell you the truth. She is my sister, but she's also my wife. She's my father's child, but not my mother's child. And so we're half brother and sister. And then he gives him all kinds of gifts, and then he gets kind of wealthy and so forth. And then he prays for Abimelech that the problems that had come upon Abimelech and his country and his people would be relieved and healed of that affliction. And then but the next chapter goes on and gives us the birth of Isaac, but and then Sarah says, get rid of Hagar and Ishmael, and sends them off. But then in the 22nd verse of the next chapter, it picks up on this story of Abimelech, and I want to go there because this kind of completes the Abimelech and Gerar saga, and it is a part of the priestly story. Anyway, at that time, Abimelech with Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my offspring or with my posterity, but as I have dealt loyally with you, you will deal with me, and with the land where you have resided as an alien. And Abraham said, I swear it. And then when Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Abraham set apart 7 ewe lambs of the flock, and Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? And he said, these 7 ewe lambs you shall accept from my hand in order that you may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore, that place was called Beersheba. And we know you're familiar with the name Beersheba. This is a significant placing of Abraham and the tradition at Beersheba and in relationship, and one of those etiologies of the origins and so forth of things. Anyway, therefore this place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. And when they had made a covenant at Beersheba, Abimelech with Phicol, the commander of his army, left and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham resided as an alien many days in the land of the Philistines. Now, I don't know how many days are, but anyway, we have that as kind of a total story that's been broken up by the redactor when the redactor was weaving the priestly and the Yahwist and the Elohist traditions into one story and so forth. But anyway, to get to the end of this sojourn in the land, we have at the other part, it lifted up that Abraham was a prophet. And we don't usually think of Abraham as a prophet. He's one of the patriarchs, but we don't think of him very often in terms of a prophet. But yet, in this text, he is called a prophet. Let's see, get down to where was that? Anyway, I'm not finding it. Anyway, it's in there. I had to go ahead and get ready, and so this has gotten a little bit cold on me. But anyway, the prophet part is, in our understanding that's become very popularized, a prophet is associated with predicting the future. Correct? That's why we usually associate the term prophet as one who predicts the future. However, before the prophets took on that future predicting dimension of their role, the prophet was basically a mediator between God and the people. And that mediation was the people were in distress, and then the prophet carried their cause to God. God had a special way of communicating with the prophet. And so we usually think of God communicating to the prophet. So the prophet goes to the people and says, "Thus says the Lord," and then gives some prediction of something that's going to happen. But the way it developed was that the mediator was in communication with God in a special way, and that the prophet carried the people's concerns to God. And there's a real close connection between prophets and the priests and so forth that we don't fully understand because we didn't live then. But the prophet had this special access to God, calling on God to save the people and to redress their grievances. So as a prophet, Moses becomes a mediator in our story who goes and hears the people's cries. He knew the people's cries. And then he encounters God at the burning bush, and then God gives him a job, a role, and so forth, to be God's spokesperson, and then to lead the children out of Egypt. But this mediator role between the people and God, but the main function was to be the link of intercession to God. So Abraham plays that role in this passage, the role of the prophet, by offering the intercessory prayer to God on behalf of King Abimelech and his people. So where the prophet then develops later on into the predictor of the future and grows out of this mediator role between the distressed people and their God, and this intercessory process. So the prophet sees the injustice and the pain and the grief of the people, and he hears their cries of distress. and he goes to mediate between the people and God, seeking God's help. And so the prophet prays prayers of intercession for the people to God, and then God responds. And God's response to those prayers is then to call the prophet to become God's spokesperson, and to go and tell Pharaoh, let my people go, or to go to the Israel's king and ruling class and tell them to stop your injustice and corruption and rule justly and fairly and care for the people like a shepherd and not as a butcher. So the prophet at this phase is the spokesman for God's truth and God's justice and God's righteousness. And then the prophet part that comes with the warning, if you do not change and stop your corrupt and unjust ways, then you will suffer the consequences. And often the consequences are to let some foreign army come and conquer you. And so the prophetic predicting part is straighten up and fly right, or else. And the or else becomes the prophecy that's the predicting the future. And we know they didn't straighten up and fly right, and so the or else came to pass. But then, after the or else comes to pass, then, because the king did not change and save the whole people, then the whole people suffered. And then the prophet, again, is the spokesperson for God, and then changed the or else message into a word of hope that God will still see your suffering, and God will redeem you, God will save you, God will send you a Messiah, or rescue you, or liberate you and take you home, and so forth. So that transition or development of the prophetic role in Israel, we see beginning with Abraham in that intercessory role of praying for the people, and to become an advocate for the powerless, or an advocate for those who are in pain and suffering. Now, since God did heal or restore Abimelech and the people of Gerar and all of their livestock, Abraham was indeed shown to be an effective prophet, a mediator, an intercessor. Another interesting point is that King Abimelech addresses Sarah when he speaks to her. Now we remember when the angels came and visited Abraham at his tent, and they're bringing the promises. Sarah is in the tent behind the curtain, and they're not talking to her. She's not a part of the conversation until, she laughs, and then, she kind of gets drawn in. But Abimelech shows her the honor and respect of talking to her directly. And that's a big step and change, and something that the people of the culture would understand as kind of shocking. My gosh, this king is talking to the wife instead of just talking to the husband. And he refers to Abraham not as her husband, but as her brother, which is kind of curious. So Abimelech has given the 100 pieces of silver to restore Sarah's honor in the eyes of the whole world, so to speak. However, there was a little bit of confusion. The people who are nomadic don't have really the wherewithal to carry huge loads of metal coin. and they didn't have banks to where they could just deposit it and then write checks when they needed to buy something. So it is suspected that possibly rather than actual pieces of silver, that the value of the gifts of the animals and the servants that Abimelech had bestowed upon Abraham was valued at 100 shekels, rather than giving those gifts and then giving this big pile of silver that then had to be carried on animals from place to place, which would have been somewhat difficult. You ever stop and think about those things? No. We just think it's, deposited in the bank and it's in your account. You don't have to worry about hauling it from place to place and protecting it. Anyway, so and I raised a question to myself: did Abimelech have to address Sarah because he was afraid Abraham wouldn't tell her? Abraham could collect all of this stuff, and then she would never know that that was rightfully hers as a way of overcoming her shame and disgrace from this transaction that had taken place. So the address does raise her status and significance as a person whom one addresses instead of a thing that one does not have to address but only talks about indirectly. Now with the intercession and the healing, we have an illustration of that promise that Abraham will become a great nation, father of many nations, when Isaac finally gets born, and then Ishmael goes on to be father of the Arabs. But here we see that Abraham fulfills that promise that God made to him, that he would be blessed to be a blessing. And so in this role as mediator who prays for and helps Abimelech, then he becomes a blessing for the first time instead of a curse. Now, in addition to the passage I went on to read to help illustrate another part that this story illustrates, that usually when we just zip on through it and try to get to the birth of Isaac and then get on with the generations, that this relationship with Abimelech is a peaceful coexistence. And they show that in the midst of this conflict over the well, that they find a way to resolve the conflict peacefully, amicably, and they stay peacefully in relationship with one another. And so in one sense, Abimelech, who is a foreigner, he is not a part of the chosen people that this little story gives us in the ending and the way it works out. It's not spoken to directly and lifted up and said, the author doesn't say, let me connect the dots for you just in case you don't connect them for yourselves. But it's kind of out there, and we know that so often in this culture where the Bible was oral for so long and they told the stories, and then even when it's written down, the stories continued to be oral, and not very many people could read. But so often when a story was told, in the minds of the listeners, they didn't do like we usually do and ask, is that true? Did that really happen? That wasn't their question. Their question was, what does the story mean? What is the story telling us? What is the story illustrating to us about ourselves and about God. And then they would have a discussion and a debate about what that would mean, and they would get to talking. Not like this Sunday school class. We don't talk and discuss and debate, but what they would do is ask what it means. And in this, so often that meaning would probably come out that the children of Israel are not God's only people. They're not the only ones God cares about. God cares about all the people, and that if Abraham is blessed to be a blessing, then this is one of the early times when that blessing goes to the other people. Other people benefit from this special relationship that God has with these people, not to make them spoiled brats, but that they can be a servant of God, helping the greater good of all God's children around the world, which is what we think the ultimate idea that we need to keep remembering. And it's interesting, King Abimelech, because he had this encounter with God and saw that God was very powerful, he wanted to stay in relationship with this special person of God so that hopefully he could keep this blessed relationship going. So he was a willing participant. But these were very primitive times, and they not only the Israelites had to learn, but the neighbors had to learn as well. So, before we move on, any questions about Abimelech and Gerar? Ishmael, when Ishmael, they're saying that that whole Arabic and Islamic tradition goes. We don't have a real genome process to keep that all straight in scientific accuracy now, but anyway. Okay, so we move from, and then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and also healed his wife and female slaves, so they bore children. For the Lord had closed fast the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. Chapter 21, we move on. The Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Now, that verse is the Yahwist, and that's 21:1. But then the redactor drops in the priestly verses. In verse 2, Sarah conceived. Now, supposedly, she's already conceived, but now the priestly version is stating that now she conceives and goes 9 months very fast and bore a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah bore him. And we already had earlier that he was going to be named Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now, that's priestly, and then it drops back to, now Sarah said. Now, if we're going to get the flow, we'd have, the Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. And then we would pick up, now Sarah said, God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would ever have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Now it sounds kind of redundant, and it is, because they're splicing these two traditions. together. But it's kind of curious that after all of this anticipation and waiting, that is kind of anticlimactic. I mean, that's it. There is no great birth narrative, no story about what happened, that how she went into labor. I mean, was labor 36 hours or was it 15 minutes? I mean, it's there's nothing there about that, and any big celebration. I mean, they've been waiting so long. I mean, they didn't call in the relatives. Now, when we have births within our church, a lot of times when we try to go visit at the hospital, it's kind of hard to get through the crowd of relatives that have all gathered for the birth. But there's not much here. It's just, like I said, just really kind of anticlimactic, and there aren't any big extra birth narratives. It reminded me of some of these TV shows, a lot of the crime scene, CSI, this, that, and the other, and they've got this death and this murder, and they're trying to figure it out, and they've got this complicated plot, and they're thinking it's this one, and then something happened, no, it's not that one, and then it's thinking it's that one, and then all of a sudden it's, they got all this complication, and there's only 3 or 4 minutes left in the show, and all of a sudden it's all wrapped up and it's done, and previews for next week, and you think, well, they ran out of time. They just ran out of time, so they had to hurry and wrap it up. Yes? Well, that's right. There weren't any relatives because they had outlived them all. That's right. And of course, Hagar wasn't going to be rejoicing and about all of this. So, yeah, that would be the case. Yeah, we don't have all the big extended family when we have the 12 tribes of Israel and all those in-laws coming up. But anyway, but we don't have, like I say, it's kind of curious that we don't have a big birth narrative of how the birth came about. And it may be that this is intentional by the ancient authors, because the main point that they're trying to get across is this was God's doing, and God fulfilled God's promise. That's the point. God fulfilled God's promise. And we don't want you to miss that point. If I start telling you this intriguing story of all these details and happenings, you might forget about the fact that this was God's doing, and that God fulfilled the promise and overcame all the obstacles. And in spite of all the obstacles and all the unbelief, God remained faithful, and it's happened. But then we have to go on with the story. And what happens next is, he's born, circumcised on the 8th day, and then the child grows. The child grew and was weaned. Now, they didn't have formula and baby bottles, so when was the child weaned? Between 2 and 3 years. So between 2 and 3 years have gone by between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In 6 words, the child gets grown up to about 3 years old, and he's weaned. And then Abraham made a great feast on that day that Isaac was weaned. Now, why would they make a big feast then? Well, in a lot of primitive cultures, infant mortality is very high. And sometimes they don't do like Isaac did and name a child when it's born. Some withhold the name until the child survives, till it's weaned. And it's almost like so many die, they don't want to really get excited and invest emotionally as a big family and culture. It's hard for the mother not to invest, but sometimes the culture doesn't. And a sign of that is that they don't bestow a name until they think, this one's made it. This one's going to make it. But anyway, so they have a big celebration. But during the celebration, it seems that Sarah observes the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. We've got a blending of the traditions, and the priestly version is very set on trying to extend the age to make them very old. And it has told us earlier that Abraham was 86 when Ishmael was born, now 100 when Isaac is born. So that's 14 years plus until weaning 16 or 17. And so the Ishmael playing with the 3-year-old frightens Sarah. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out the slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." Now, not inherit along with my son Isaac doesn't seem to be afraid that Ishmael is going to harm Isaac, but rather goes back to a time when we hadn't extended the age so far, and that possibly Isaac and Ishmael were very close in age, small children playing together, which would raise the question that little children can play together, and little children do not have a sense of class structure and hierarchy. They're all equal as children. But the parents looking at them would thinking, this isn't right. We have class differences. They're not supposed to be equal. And if they're equal now and they get along and they play together, will they be equal when they're grown? Well, we've got to intervene right now and start establishing class structure. And in a nomadic society, that's kind of hard to do, so we get this aspect of cast this slave woman with her son, cast out slave woman and her son. The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to do, do as she tells you. For it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So don't worry, it all works out okay in the end. However, knowing that doesn't mean that between the now and working out in the end that there won't be great suffering and distress. So one can have confidence that it'll all work out in the end, but there's still, you don't want the ones you care about to have to go through suffering and distress unnecessarily. But anyway, seems to convince Abraham, and he says, okay. So he rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. Puts food and water and a child on her back. This child is maybe 17 years old. You can picture carrying piggyback. Does that make sense? No. Again, it goes back to a time in the stories of a time when Ishmael and Isaac may have been understood to be about the same age and little children. So that, not necessarily as a 2 or 3 year old, wouldn't be on her back, but on her hip. And the food and water on her, over her shoulder. So it's kind of hard to conceptualize the story when they've kind of blended these traditions and they're trying to stay true to the priestly timing and aging of Abraham, and keep that straight with a story that comes from another part of the tradition that doesn't have the great age and the great age difference between the two boys. So anyway, so she departed, and she wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. And now when the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. So here's this mother throwing this 17-year-old under a bush, or this mother placing a very small child under a bush. And then she went and sat down opposite of him, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, how far is a bow shot? 100 yards? Anybody an archer? 50 yards? 75 yards? It's not miles away, but it's not right up close either. Anyway, about a bow shot away. For she said, do not let me look on the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. She lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. She lifted her voice, but God hears the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, and again, this is one of those circumlocutions where we're at a time when it's presumptuous to feel like God's self, the almighty creator of the universe, would lower God's self to talk to a human being. So we can't say that, so we have to say God sent a messenger with this message. But in all likelihood, it means God hears her and God responds, what troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid. For I, God, or God, has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him. So again, don't feel bad in your suffering and your misery. It's all going to work out okay in the end. But then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. Now God was with the boy, and he grew up, and he lived in the wilderness, and he became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. And then, period. And then, at that time, Abimelech, with his commander of the army, Philcol, and picks up that story. So he just cuts off there and goes in the other story. One of the things that I found really fascinating here is this is the Elohist story. And remember last time when we first came to the Elohist, they have a much, when we compare their stories that are parallels with the Yahwist or priestly, the Elohist seems to be a little deeper and a little more reflective on how things work. And as I mentioned, so often when God communicates in an Elohist story, very often it is through a dream, not that direct way or sending angels, although he does have an angel here in speaking to her and dialoguing with her. But in this one, instead of some magic way that God produces water for them, sort of like when Moses strikes a rock and then it gushes forth, that God opens her eyes so she sees what is already there. And I think that's really a very important illustration of how God can help us and how God works so often in the midst of our problems and distresses. So often when we're in a crisis and we're all distressed and we just don't see a way out, we don't know what we're going to do, how we're going to solve this, and we cry for help. And really when we're crying for help, we want somebody else to fix it for us. Somebody to come rescue us. Someone to just take that problem off of our backs and deal with it so we don't have to. Or some magical, miraculous, divine intervention. And a lot of faith witness stories that I have heard, particularly on the more conservative and evangelical side, tend to have a miracle. I remember out at in Broken Arrow, the Rhema Bible College, that there would be a lot of times they had a problem with this, that they were supposed to just trust that God would provide, and that money would appear in your banking account miraculously. So you can write the check today, and the money would be there to cover it. Well, they were preaching and teaching that kind of believe in God's providence and grace to solve your problems. Checks were bouncing all over the place in Broken Arrow, and Rhema was getting in big trouble with the community business people. And so they had to amend that teaching. That miraculous way of God intervening and solving problems didn't really work that way. We accidentally, we knew she was from Rhema, but she was a student there, and she had been listening to their teachings, and they had told them and told her, and she believed it, that if she had enough faith and truly believed, that she wouldn't get sick. Well, one day she caught the flu, and she was hysterical because it meant she didn't have enough faith because she got sick. And I'd gotten a distressed phone call from some kid that they told him he had victory in his driving. He had victory in his driving. God had saved him from all his driving problems. Well, the reason he called me is he had a crash. But the flip side of that, believe in God's great divine intervention that's miraculously going to solve your problems for you, when they don't get solved, it's kind of a black and white kind of theology that if you're right with God and you have faith, then you're saved and your life is great. But the flip side of that, if bad things are happening, then you're not saved, you're going to hell, and God does not like you. So if you want to get right with God and have all these wonderful things happen, Just believe, have this strong faith, and it'll happen. But the danger is when it doesn't happen, it gives you the other message that God does not care for you, God has abandoned you, and you are not worthy of God's grace. You are condemned. And so I think they've matured in their theology out there, and they're not pushing that so hard as they did in earlier years, which is a good thing. But this passage, I think, is so helpful that with our prayers and our faith and our trusting in God, then so often when we relax in that trust and open our eyes and look around, then we will be able to see what God has already provided, not miraculously, but in the divine scheme of things, the help is there. The church is there with all kinds of structure and resources. Good Christian people who care will be there. The advances in medical science and research is there with all kinds of help. And the biggest part in so many of life's challenges and problems, to really get a solution, we can't have the miraculous poof, it's all fixed. It's a process. It's a long process that we have to be a part of. And for us to be a part of it and know what to do, we need to have our eyes wide open and observe. I remember in one of our big fundraising programs to build a building, we got a consultant to come help us, and it was so interesting in the whole planning process for what to do for the leadership team, and then in the promotion to the membership. We had all of these steps to assess our needs and get the vision of what we wanted and what was really going to be helpful. But at every one of them was something very businesslike and very practical and realistic this world. But between each one of those steps was pray about it. Pray about it. And the reason for that, in a purely practical and common sense way, is once you've thought you've made a decision, step back a minute and reflect on it. Give it some time for other ideas to precipitate or percolate up. And in a spiritual realm, take it to God and see what God puts on your heart, what thoughts God might put in your mind for relating to that decision. And if it's kind of confirmed, then you move ahead. But if you get something that says or makes you not feel quite right about it, then you go back and re-examine it and you pray some more for what is God trying to show you or put upon your heart or put an idea in your mind. In David's story about his journey in faith, you may remember he was talking about, he had these thoughts and these feelings about his career in ministry, and he prayed about it. And that there was this interaction between what he was feeling and thinking and wanting, and then this interaction in his prayer life with God, and what messages, thoughts, feelings, ideas came to him in that process. And so I believe that that's really the way God works with us. is we have a crisis, we have a situation, we cry out to God, we're asking for God's help, but then we listen, we wait for what God may lay upon our hearts, and then we look around. We look around. What might already be there that God has provided that is a resource, that's a help to us, rather than looking for some miracle that violates all the natural processes that God established in the universe and in the community. So anyway, I think this is a very ancient wisdom already being expressed right here by the Elohist, who was more analytical and deeper in his thinking about how God works with us, and has planted that in this ancient text, and is relevant to our faith journey today. Well, that's gotten us through an hour almost. And then we can... There's some commentary in these here books about the that dynamic that I'll go back and pick up and we'll review. It's the Rosenblatt, who's a psychologist, has a lot of things about stepfamilies that she counsels today in the Hagar and Sarah and Abraham dynamics that are some interesting thoughts there to share. And then, yeah. Oh, yeah, sure.
In regards to tradition of firstborn and birthright.
Oh, yeah.
How does that play a part in this story?
Oh, you get a gold star. It's a recurring theme in the biblical narrative that God, well, there's the primogenitor, the firstborn is the one who's supposed to take over and carry the name and carry the family business and resources and so forth. Also has the responsibility for caring for the aged parent. But in so many of the biblical stories, God chooses someone else. There's someone else who isn't the cultural norm that's expected. And so, yeah, that's a very, very powerful message, and we get it here. And it's not, since we've got different mothers, it's a little bit blurred. But yet, for Abraham and in a patriarchal society, firstborn son is Ishmael, and he should be the one to carry the name. But no, he's cast aside. So yeah, that's a really good point that we continue to run into throughout the rest of the Bible. So, any other? Well, I'll let you out 2 minutes early. Let's pray. Well, dear God, we are your people who still try to figure out what we should do in our everyday existence. And when we meet problems and challenges and things that we can't handle ourselves, we call upon you to help us. Not only do you give us insight and sometimes open our eyes, but sometimes you instill within us a drive, a motivation, a desire to do what is right, even though it's the most difficult thing to choose. Help us as we reach out and discuss and seek the resources that you provide for us to continue to choose to do what is right. In the name of the Christ. Amen.